Sometimes the most profound changes happen in the quietest moments. In operating rooms across the world, silence can mean many things: concentration, precision, or sometimes the weight of impossible decisions. But what happens when that silence becomes something else entirely? When it becomes the sound of a system breaking down, of hope fading, and of people forgetting why they chose to heal others in the first place. This is the story of Metropolitan General Hospital's cardiac surgery unit, where the brightest minds in medicine found themselves lost in a darkness they couldn't diagnose. It's about what happens when excellence becomes routine, when saving lives becomes just another day at work, and when the very people meant to heal begin to lose their own humanity. But most importantly, this is a story about how one person, someone nobody expected, someone the system almost overlooked, stepped into that silence and reminded everyone what it truly means to care. Sometimes the most powerful medicine isn't found in a prescription bottle or a surgical instrument. Sometimes it's found in the simple act of seeing people as human beings rather than just cases to be solved. What you're about to read will change how you think about hospitals, about healing, and about the quiet heroes who walk among us every day, often unnoticed until the moment when their presence becomes the difference between hope and despair. Dr. Marcus Chen had performed over 3,000 heart surgeries in his 15-year career, and each one had been a masterpiece of precision. His hands never trembled, his decisions never wavered, and his success rate was the envy of cardiac surgeons nationwide. The operating room at Metropolitan General Hospital had become his kingdom, a sterile realm where he commanded respect and delivered miracles with the regularity of a factory assembly line. But on that Tuesday morning in October, as he scrubbed in for what should have been a routine bypass surgery, something felt different. The usual pre-surgery banter between the surgical team was absent. The nurses moved with mechanical efficiency, their faces hidden behind masks that seemed to reflect more than just professional protocol. Even Dr. Sarah Martinez, his trusted anesthesiologist for the past 7 years, offered only a curt nod when he entered the OR. The patient, Robert Williams, was a 54-year-old construction worker who had suffered a massive heart attack 3 weeks earlier. His wife, Linda, had sat in the waiting room every day since his admission, clutching a thermos of coffee that had long grown cold and a worn photograph of their family vacation to the Grand Canyon. She had asked the same question to every nurse, every resident, every person in scrubs who would listen. When will my husband be okay again? Chen had reviewed the case files with his usual methodical approach. The blockages were severe but manageable. The surgery would take approximately 4 hours. The recovery time would be standard. The prognosis was favorable. These were the facts, clean and quantifiable, the kind of certainty that had made him one of the most sought-after cardiac surgeons on the East Coast. As the team positioned Mr. Williams on the operating table, Dr. Chen noticed the patient's weathered hands, calloused from years of honest work. For a moment, an unexpected thought crossed his mind about the bridges this man had helped build, the homes he had constructed, the tangible legacy of a life spent creating things that would outlast him. But the thought was quickly pushed aside as the monitors began their steady electronic symphony and the familiar rhythm of surgery took over. The operation began with the same precision that had defined Dr. Chen's career. Each incision was calculated, each suture perfect. The surgical team moved like a well-rehearsed orchestra, anticipating each other's needs without words. But as the hours passed, the silence in the OR grew heavier, more oppressive. It wasn't the focused quiet of concentration, but something else entirely. A coldness that seemed to seep through the sterile air. Nurse Patricia Gonzalez, a 28-year veteran of the cardiac unit, found herself watching Dr. Chen's technique with growing unease. She had assisted in hundreds of his surgeries and had always marveled at his skill. But lately she noticed something troubling in his approach. The artistry was still there, the technical excellence undeniable, but the humanities seemed to have been surgically removed. When complications arose, as they inevitably do in cardiac surgery, Dr. Nutchess said. Chen's response was swift and effective. A small tear in the arterial wall was repaired with mechanical precision. An unexpected rhythm disturbance was corrected with practiced ease. But throughout each crisis, his demeanor remained unchanged, clinical and detached, as if he were repairing a machine rather than fighting to save a man's life. The other team members had begun to mirror this emotional distance. Dr. James Patterson, the chief resident, had once been passionate about patient care, spending extra hours with families and following up on recoveries with genuine interest. Now he spoke only in medical terminology, reducing patients to collections of symptoms and surgical procedures. The younger residents, learning from their mentors, adopted the same professional detachment, mistaking coldness for competence. In the weeks leading up to Mr. Williams' surgery, this emotional sterility had begun to affect patient outcomes in ways that couldn't be measured on charts or reflected in mortality statistics. Families complained that they felt ignored, that their questions were answered with impatience, that the doctors seemed to view them as obstacles rather than partners in their loved ones' care. Patient satisfaction scores had dropped, but more troubling were the subtle signs that the staff themselves were losing something essential to their calling. Nurse Gonzalez had watched young nurses leave the cardiac unit citing burnout and disillusionment. She had seen residents question their career choices not because of the demanding workload or the pressure of life and death decisions, but because they felt they were losing their compassion in an environment that seemed to value technical skill above human connection. The surgery on Mr. Williams proceeded flawlessly from a technical standpoint. Each graft was positioned perfectly, each anastomosis completed with textbook precision. The monitor showed stable vital signs, and the surgical timeline was ahead of schedule. By every measurable standard, the operation was a success. Yet as Dr. Chen prepared to close the chest, something felt fundamentally wrong. It was Nurse Gonzalez who first noticed the change in Mr. Williams's color, a subtle shift that might have been missed by someone less experienced, but her trained eye caught the slight grayish tint that suggested inadequate perfusion despite perfect surgical technique. She called attention to it, her voice steady but urgent, and Dr. Chen immediately began investigating the cause. The problem was elusive, nothing that showed up clearly on the monitors or in the blood work. It was the kind of complication that required not just technical skill, but intuition, the ability to read the subtle language of a human body under stress. Dr. Chen worked with his usual competence, checking each graft, adjusting medications, consulting with the anesthesiologist, but the patient's condition remained concerning. As the team worked to stabilize Mr. Williams, the silence in the OR became almost suffocating. Each team member focused intently on their specific responsibilities, but there was no sense of unified purpose, no shared commitment to the life that hung in the balance. They had become experts in their individual roles, but had forgotten how to function as a cohesive unit dedicated to healing. Outside the OR, Linda Williams continued her vigil in the surgical waiting area. She had been joined by her 2 adult children and several family friends, all of them clinging to the hope that Dr. Chen's reputation suggested. They had heard about his success rates, his technical expertise, his standing in the medical community. What they didn't know was that something intangible but crucial had been lost in the cardiac unit, something that no amount of technical skill could replace. The surgery stretched into its 6th hour, well beyond the projected time frame. Dr. Chen's frustration was evident only to those who knew him well. A slight tightening around his eyes, a barely perceptible change in the rhythm of his movements. He was encountering a problem that couldn't be solved through surgical technique alone, a situation that required the kind of collaborative insight that had once defined his team, but had gradually eroded over months of increasing emotional distance. As the afternoon wore on, other staff members began to take notice of the prolonged surgery. Dr. Elizabeth Harper, the department head, found herself checking on the OR more frequently than usual. She had been growing concerned about the atmosphere in the cardiac unit, the reports of patient dissatisfaction, and the unusually high turnover rate among nursing staff. Now, faced with a complication in what should have been a routine surgery, she began to wonder if the problems ran deeper than she had initially realized. The shift change approached, bringing with it the usual shuffle of personnel. The evening staff arrived with their own sets of concerns and preoccupations, ready to take over care of the post-surgical patients. But in OR3, the surgery continued, a testament to both the complexity of cardiac medicine and the growing dysfunction of a team that had lost its way. Mr. Williams's condition stabilized eventually, but not through any single intervention or moment of brilliant insight. Rather, it was through the painstaking process of adjusting and readjusting, monitoring and remonitoring, a grinding technical approach that achieved the desired result without any sense of triumph or satisfaction. When Dr. Chen finally closed the chest, the room felt heavy with exhaustion and something else, a nagging sense that they had succeeded in spite of themselves, rather than because of their teamwork. The post-operative briefing was brief and clinical. Dr. Chen reported the technical details to the waiting family with his usual professional demeanor, explaining the successful completion of the grafts and the stable vital signs. But when Linda Williams asked about her husband's prognosis, about when she might expect him to return to normal activities, about what the future held, Dr. Chen's responses felt hollow and unsatisfying, technically accurate but emotionally barren. As the evening shift took over, Mr. Williams's care, the day team dispersed to their various responsibilities with little discussion of the prolonged surgery or its implications. It was as if the difficulties had been an anomaly, something to be forgotten rather than analyzed and learned from. The opportunity for growth, for team building, for reconnecting with their shared purpose, was lost in the hurried transition between shifts and the pressure to move on to the next case. That night, as Dr. Chen completed his notes and prepared to leave the hospital, he found himself pausing in the corridor outside the cardiac ICU. Through the glass walls, he could see Mr. Press Williams connected to various monitors, his chest rising and falling with mechanical regularity. The surgery had been successful by every objective measure, yet Dr. Chen felt no sense of accomplishment, no satisfaction in having saved another life. The feeling troubled him more than he cared to admit. For years, he had prided himself on his emotional control, his ability to remain objective and focused in the face of life and death situations. He had believed that this detachment made him a better surgeon, more reliable and effective. But now, standing in the quiet hallway with only the soft beeping of monitors for company, he began to question whether something essential had been lost in his pursuit of professional excellence. The cardiac unit at Metropolitan General Hospital had become a place where technical miracles were performed daily, where the most complex surgical procedures were executed with precision and skill. But it had also become a place where the human element of healing had been gradually eroded, where patients were reduced to medical problems and families were seen as complications to be managed rather than partners in the healing process. The stage was set for a reckoning that none of them could have anticipated, a moment when the accumulated weight of professional detachment would collide with the fundamental purpose of their calling. The OR had indeed grown silent, but it was the silence of disconnection rather than concentration, of isolation rather than unity. Change was coming, though none of them knew it yet. Maya Rodriguez arrived at Metropolitan General Hospital on a gray November morning, carrying a worn leather satchel and harboring none of the usual anxiety that accompanies a first day at a new job. At 32, she had already worked in cardiac units across 3 different states, drawn not by ambition or the pursuit of prestige, but by something far more personal, a calling that had been forged in the crucible of her own family's medical crisis 15 years earlier. The human resources orientation was standard fare, policies and procedures, insurance information, parking assignments, and the usual warnings about patient confidentiality. Maya listened politely while mentally cataloging the subtle signs she had learned to recognize in hospital environments, the way staff members interacted in the hallways, the tone of conversations between doctors and nurses, the general energy level. All these factors told her more about a medical unit than any official documentation ever could. Her first assignment was to the cardiac ICU, specifically to assist with post-operative care under the supervision of Nurse Gonzalez. The veteran nurse greeted Maya with professional courtesy but little warmth, a reaction Maya had encountered before in units where new staff were viewed with suspicion until they proved themselves capable of handling the intense demands of cardiac care. The first patient Maya was assigned to observe was Robert Williams, now 3 days post-surgery and struggling with complications that kept him sedated and connected to multiple life support systems. His wife Linda had barely left his bedside, surviving on vending machine coffee and the kindness of family members who brought her sandwiches she rarely touched. As Maya reviewed Mr. Williams's chart, she noticed something that struck her as unusual. The medical notes were thorough and technically precise, documenting every medication adjustment, every vital sign change, every procedural intervention. But there was no mention of the patient as a person, no acknowledgement of his family's distress, no indication that anyone had taken the time to understand who Robert Williams was beyond his cardiac pathology. During her orientation rounds, Maya observed the interactions between the medical staff and Mr. Williams' family. Dr. Chen's updates were delivered with clinical efficiency, focusing on blood pressure numbers, cardiac enzyme levels, and respiratory function. The information was accurate and important, but Linda Williams' eyes glazed over as she tried to translate medical terminology into something resembling hope for her husband's recovery. Maya watched Linda struggle to formulate questions that might bridge the gap between her need for understanding and the medical team's technical explanations. She saw how the woman's shoulders sagged when Dr. Chen concluded his updates with phrases like, "We'll continue monitoring," and "It's still too early to make definitive predictions." These weren't inadequate responses from a medical standpoint, but they left the human beings involved feeling isolated and uncertain. On her second day, Maya was assigned to assist with a new admission, Maria Santos, a 68-year-old grandmother who had suffered a heart attack while babysitting her grandchildren. The parallels to her own grandmother's experience years earlier struck Maya immediately, not just in the medical circumstances but in the family dynamics surrounding the crisis. Maria's daughter, Carmen, had arrived at the hospital in a state of barely controlled panic, her clothes still bearing traces of flour from the bread she had been baking when the call came. She clutched her mother's rosary and peppered the medical staff with questions that revealed both her deep love and her complete confusion about cardiac medicine. Maya observed Dr. Patterson, the chief resident, as he explained the need for emergency catheterization to Carmen. His explanation was technically accurate and delivered with what he presumably believed was appropriate professional demeanor. But Maya could see that Carmen was absorbing almost nothing of the medical information while drowning in anxiety about her mother's survival. During a quiet moment between procedures, Maya approached Carmen in the family waiting area. She didn't offer medical opinions or predictions. That wasn't her role and wouldn't have been appropriate. Instead, she simply sat beside the worried daughter and asked about Maria Santos, the person, not the patient. The response was immediate and profound. Carmen began talking about her mother's legendary cooking, her stubborn independence, her habit of sneaking extra cookies to her grandchildren when their parents weren't looking. She described Maria's weekly ritual of calling each of her 5 children to check on their families, her insistence on maintaining her own small garden. Even at 68, her pride in her job as a school cafeteria worker, where 3 generations of children had learned to love her homemade soup. As Carmen spoke, something remarkable happened. The medical crisis didn't disappear, but it became contextualized within the framework of a full human life. Maria Santos wasn't just a 68-year-old female with acute coronary syndrome. She was a woman whose absence would leave holes in multiple lives, whose recovery would mean the return of stories and laughter, and the kind of unconditional love that grandmothers specialize in providing. Maya's approach didn't go unnoticed by the other staff members, though their initial reactions were mixed. Some of the nurses appreciated her willingness to spend time with families, recognizing it as something they wished they could do more of themselves. Others viewed it with suspicion, wondering if Maya was trying to make them look bad by comparison or simply didn't understand the time pressures they all faced. Dr. Toms Chen observed Maya's interactions with growing curiosity. In his experience, new nurses typically focused on mastering the technical aspects of cardiac care during their first weeks, concentrating on medication protocols, monitoring procedures, and emergency response systems. Maya demonstrated competence in all these areas, but she also seemed to operate from a different philosophical framework entirely. The difference became most apparent during a particularly challenging night shift when Mr. Williams experienced a series of cardiac arrhythmias that required immediate intervention. Maya assisted with the medical procedures efficiently and without drama, but she also did something that surprised everyone present. After the crisis had passed and Mr. Williams had been stabilized, she took a moment to explain to Linda Williams, in simple terms, what had happened and what it meant for her husband's recovery. The explanation wasn't lengthy or complex, and it didn't venture into medical territory that was beyond Maya's scope of practice, but it acknowledged Linda as an intelligent person, capable of understanding her husband's condition, and it treated her emotional distress as a legitimate concern rather than an inconvenience to be managed. Dr. Chen found himself listening to Maya's explanation and realizing that he had never thought to provide that kind of contextualized information to patients' families. His updates had always focused on the medical facts because that was his area of expertise, but he had never considered that families might need help translating those facts into a framework they could understand and use to cope with their situation.
So, this is the book which...
The impact of Maya's approach became even more apparent when Maria Santos regained consciousness after her cardiac catheterization. Instead of waking up in a sterile environment surrounded by strangers discussing her condition in medical terminology, she opened her eyes to find Maya at her bedside, speaking softly in Spanish and explaining where she was and what had happened in terms that acknowledged both her medical situation and her dignity as a person. Maya had learned Spanish specifically to communicate with patients and families in her previous positions, recognizing that medical crises are traumatic enough without the additional barrier of language differences. But more than the linguistic accommodation, it was her instinct to approach Maria as a whole person that made the difference in those crucial first moments of consciousness. The ripple effects of Maya's presence began to spread through the cardiac unit in subtle but significant ways. Other nurses started paying more attention to their interactions with families. Not because they were instructed to do so, but because Maya's example reminded them of aspects of patient care they had gradually allowed to atrophy. Residents began spending a few extra minutes with patients, asking questions that went beyond immediate medical concerns. Chen found himself observing these changes with a mixture of professional interest and personal discomfort. Maya's approach wasn't revolutionary or dramatically different from standard nursing practice, but it highlighted how far he and his team had drifted from the holistic approach to patient care that had originally drawn them to medicine. The transformation wasn't immediate or uniform. Some staff members remained skeptical of what they viewed as inefficient use of time and emotional energy. The pressures that had contributed to the unit's emotional sterility, heavy patient loads, administrative demands, the constant stress of life and death decisions, hadn't magically disappeared with Maya's arrival, but something fundamental had shifted in the cardiac unit's atmosphere. Conversations between team members began to include more references to patients as people rather than just medical cases. Family concerns were addressed with more patience and empathy. The silence in the ORs began to feel less oppressive, more collaborative. Maya herself remained focused on her work, without any apparent awareness of the changes she was catalyzing. She approached each patient and family with the same combination of professional competence and genuine human concern that had characterized her nursing practice throughout her career. She wasn't trying to reform the cardiac unit or prove a point about patient care philosophy. She was simply doing what came naturally to her. The real test of the changes Maya had initiated came during a particularly difficult case. A young father named David Park who arrived in the emergency room with massive heart damage from a previously undiagnosed genetic condition. At 35, with 2 young children and a pregnant wife, David represented exactly the kind of case that could either galvanize a medical team or crush their spirits. Dr. Chen took the lead on David's case, as he had on hundreds of similar situations throughout his career. The surgical challenges were significant, requiring multiple procedures and innovative techniques. But this time, something was different in how the team approached not just the medical aspects of David's care, but the human dimensions as well. Maya worked closely with David's wife, Jennifer, helping her navigate the complex emotions of watching her husband fight for his life while managing her own pregnancy and caring for their 2 children. The support wasn't just emotional. Maya connected Jennifer with hospital social services, helped coordinate childcare through family members, and ensured that Jennifer had access to the medical information she needed to make informed decisions about her husband's care. Dr. Chen found himself drawn into these family-centered discussions in ways that felt both unfamiliar and oddly natural. Instead of limiting his interactions with Jennifer to brief medical updates, he began to engage with her questions about David's long-term prognosis, his ability to return to work, and the implications of his genetic condition for their children. These conversations required Dr. Chen to think about David Park not just as a challenging surgical case, but as a young man with responsibilities and dreams, and people who depended on him. The medical considerations remained paramount, but they were now embedded within a larger understanding of what David's recovery would mean to the people who loved him. The shift in approach didn't make David's case any easier. From a technical standpoint, the surgical procedures were still complex, the recovery still uncertain, the risks still significant, but the entire team seemed more engaged, more invested, more unified in their commitment to achieving the best possible outcome. For the first time in months, the silence in the OR during David's surgeries felt purposeful rather than cold, focused rather than disconnected. The team worked with a renewed sense of shared mission that extended beyond technical excellence to encompass genuine care for the human being whose life they held in their hands. Maya continued her work with characteristic quiet competence, unaware that her presence had become a catalyst for rediscovering something the cardiac unit had lost. The change wasn't dramatic or sudden, but it was real and growing, spreading through the unit like a gentle but persistent current that was beginning to transform how everyone approached their calling to heal. The transformation of the cardiac unit at Metropolitan General Hospital didn't announce itself with fanfare or dramatic declarations. Instead, it emerged gradually through 1,000 small moments of human connection that began to redefine what excellence meant in the practice of medicine. By December, 3 months after Maya Rodriguez's arrival, the changes had become so integrated into the unit's culture that newer staff members couldn't imagine it operating any other way. Dr. Chen first became fully aware of the transformation during a routine surgery on Eleanor Matthews, an 82-year-old retired piano teacher who needed valve replacement surgery. The case was medically straightforward, but Eleanor's family situation was complex. Her only daughter lived across the country and couldn't travel due to her own health issues. leaving Eleanor largely alone except for a network of former students who had become her chosen family. As Dr. Chen prepared for Eleanor's surgery, he found himself reviewing not just her medical history but the notes Maya had compiled about her personal background. Eleanor had taught piano for over 50 years, had never married but had considered her students her children, and maintained correspondence with dozens of former pupils who were now adults with families of their own. Several of these former students had arranged to take turns staying with her during her hospitalization, creating an unconventional but deeply caring support system. The surgery itself proceeded with Dr. Chen's characteristic technical excellence, but something had changed in how he approached the work. Instead of viewing Eleanor simply as an elderly patient with valvular disease, he found himself thinking about the music that had flowed through her hands for decades, the young lives she had shaped, the legacy of creativity and discipline she had built through her teaching. During the operation, when a minor complication arose requiring quick decision-making, Dr. Chen noticed how naturally the entire team collaborated to address the issue. The communication was clear and efficient, but it also carried an underlying sense of shared investment in Eleanor's outcome that went beyond professional responsibility. They weren't just solving a technical problem. They were working together to ensure that Eleanor could return to the life and relationships that gave her existence meaning. Maya had been assigned to Eleanor's post-operative care, and Dr. Chen observed her interactions with both the patient and her unusual family of former students. Maya didn't treat the non-traditional support system as an inconvenience to be managed, but rather as a resource to be utilized in Eleanor's recovery. She educated Eleanor's former students about warning signs to watch for, helped them understand the recovery timeline, and created a communication system that kept everyone informed while maintaining appropriate privacy boundaries. The impact of this approach became evident when Eleanor experienced a minor setback during her recovery, a common occurrence that typically results in extended hospitalization and significant patient anxiety. Instead of facing this challenge alone or with only medical staff for support, Eleanor had her chosen family of former students providing encouragement, sharing memories of her teaching, and maintaining the social connections that were crucial to her emotional well-being. Dr.
Chen found himself stopping by Eleanor's room more frequently than was medically necessary, drawn by the lively conversations and genuine affection that filled the space. He witnessed Eleanor's face light up when former students shared stories of their own children beginning piano lessons, saw her provide gentle guidance about practice techniques and stage fright, and observed how her identity as a teacher remained intact despite her medical vulnerability.
The experience forced Dr. Chen to confront how dramatically his approach to patient care had evolved over the past few months. Without consciously deciding to change his practice patterns, he had begun to see patients as complete human beings rather than just collections of symptoms requiring medical intervention. The shift hadn't compromised his technical skills or efficiency. If anything, it had enhanced his ability to make decisions that served patients' overall well-being rather than just addressing their immediate medical needs. This evolution in perspective became even more apparent during a particularly challenging case that arrived in late December. Thomas Chen, no relation to Dr.
Chen, despite the shared surname, was a 40-year-old single father whose massive heart attack had left him requiring emergency surgery and prolonged intensive care. His 12-year-old daughter Sophie had no other immediate family and faced the terrifying prospect of potentially losing her only parent.
The medical complexity of Thomas's case would have been sufficient to fully occupy Dr. Chen's attention in the past.
The damage to Thomas's heart was extensive, requiring innovative surgical techniques and careful post-operative management, but Maya's influence had taught the entire team to consider the broader human context surrounding every patient, and Sophie's situation became an integral part of how they approached her father's care.
Maya worked with hospital social services to ensure Sophie had appropriate care and support during her father's hospitalization. But more than that, she helped Sophie understand her father's condition in age-appropriate terms, encouraged her to participate in his care in meaningful ways, and maintained hope while being honest about the challenges ahead. Dr. Chen found himself including Sophie in conversations about her father's progress, explaining procedures in terms a 12-year-old could understand, and helping her feel like a valued member of her father's care team, rather than just a worried observer. The additional time and emotional energy required by this approach might once have seemed inefficient, but Dr. Chen discovered that Sophie's involvement actually enhanced her father's recovery by providing him with motivation and connection to the life he was fighting to return to. The transformation extended beyond individual patient cases to affect the overall culture of the cardiac unit. Team meetings began to include discussions not just of medical outcomes but of patient and family satisfaction.
Staff members started sharing stories about their patients' lives outside the hospital, celebrating recoveries not just as medical successes but as human triumphs. Nurse Gonzalez, who had initially been skeptical of Maya's approach, became one of its strongest advocates after witnessing how it enhanced rather than complicated patient care.
She began mentoring younger nurses not just in technical skills but in the art of seeing patients as whole human beings deserving of dignity, respect, and genuine care.
Dr.
Patterson, the chief resident, found that his increased attention to patients' personal circumstances actually improved his diagnostic accuracy. By taking time to understand patients' living situations, social support systems, and personal concerns, he gained insights that helped him identify potential complications and develop more effective treatment plans. The changes weren't without challenges.
Some staff members struggled to balance the increased emotional investment with the practical demands of a busy cardiac unit. There were concerns about maintaining professional boundaries while providing more personalized care.
The hospital administration questioned whether the additional time spent with patients and families was cost-effective, but the measurable outcomes spoke for themselves. Patient satisfaction scores improved dramatically. Staff turnover decreased significantly. Medical outcomes showed marginal but consistent improvement, particularly in areas related to patient compliance with treatment plans and post-discharge care. The cardiac unit began receiving recognition not just for its technical excellence but for its holistic approach to patient care. Maya continued her work with characteristic humility, seemingly unaware of the transformation she had catalyzed. When colleagues praised her impact on the unit's culture, she deflected credit to the entire team and insisted she was simply doing what any competent nurse should do. Her perspective remained focused on individual patients and families rather than on broader questions of healthcare philosophy or medical culture. The true measure of the transformation became apparent during a crisis in early January. The cardiac unit faced an influx of patients following a multi-car accident that resulted in several individuals requiring emergency cardiac surgery. The increased workload and emotional intensity of treating multiple trauma victims simultaneously would once have strained the unit's resources and tested everyone's ability to maintain professional composure. Instead, the team responded with remarkable cohesion and efficiency. The technical skills that had always been present were now enhanced by a shared commitment to treating each patient as a valued human being, rather than just another medical emergency. Staff members supported each other emotionally while maintaining the highest standards of medical care. Families were kept informed and involved despite the chaos of multiple simultaneous crises. Dr. Chen, leading the response to the mass casualty event, found himself coordinating not just medical interventions, but the human dimensions of care. He worked with Maya and other nurses to ensure that families were supported, that patients maintained their dignity even in the midst of medical crises, and that the unit's commitment to holistic care wasn't abandoned under pressure. The successful management of the mass casualty event earned recognition from hospital administration and demonstrated that the cardiac unit's transformation hadn't compromised its ability to handle emergencies. If anything, the stronger team cohesion and enhanced communication skills that had developed through focusing on individual patient care proved valuable during the crisis. As winter turned to spring, the changes that had begun with Maya's arrival had become so thoroughly integrated into the unit's culture that they were no longer seen as innovations, but simply as the way cardiac care should be provided. New staff members were oriented not just to medical procedures and protocols but to the unit's philosophy of treating patients as whole human beings, deserving of comprehensive care. Chen reflected on the transformation during a quiet moment between surgeries, standing in the same corridor where he had questioned his sense of professional satisfaction months earlier. The technical challenges of cardiac surgery remain the same, the life and death pressures unchanged, the need for precision and expertise still paramount. But the context within which he practiced had been fundamentally altered. Patients were no longer just medical puzzles to be solved, but human beings with stories, relationships, and dreams that extended far beyond their cardiac pathology. Families weren't obstacles to be managed, but partners in the healing process whose emotional well-being directly affected patient outcomes. Colleagues weren't just functional team members, but fellow human beings committed to the sacred work of healing. The silence that had once characterized the operating rooms at Metropolitan General Hospital had been replaced by a different kind of quiet, one that reflected focused collaboration rather than emotional disconnection, shared purpose rather than individual isolation. The team still worked with precision and professionalism, but now their technical excellence was enhanced by genuine care for the human beings whose lives they held in their hands. Maya Rodriguez had arrived at the hospital carrying nothing more revolutionary than a commitment to seeing patients as complete human beings rather than just medical cases. She hadn't set out to transform the cardiac unit's culture or prove a point about healthcare philosophy. She had simply done her job with competence and compassion, treating each patient and family with the dignity and respect she believed every person deserved. In doing so, she had reminded an entire medical team of why they had chosen careers in healing. The technical skills and medical knowledge that made them excellent physicians and nurses
were still essential, but they were now applied within a framework of human connection that honored both the science and the art of medicine. The OR had indeed fallen silent, but Maya Rodriguez had stepped in and filled that silence with something far more powerful than noise. She had restored the human heart to the practice of cardiac medicine, reminding everyone that the most important organ they worked to heal wasn't made of muscle and blood vessels, but of hope, love, and the unbreakable human spirit that refuses to surrender in the face of medical challenges.
The transformation was complete not because everything was perfect, but because the cardiac unit had rediscovered its true mission, not just to repair broken hearts, but to care for the human beings who carried them.